Okay, so welcome everyone. My name is Roger Stanev. I am a postdoc here in the Department of Philosophy. So the plan for the next hour is that we have 3 postdocs. We're going to be talking 20 minutes each and leave the last 30 minutes for Q&A. And my talk will be on an ethical view of risk in clinical trials. So once again, thank you all for being here and for the opportunity of sharing with you this ongoing work of mine. So in this talk, I propose an ethical view of risk in clinical trials, and I do so by starting with an analysis of risk. By focusing on both and ethical requirements of clinical trials, I argue that the orthodox view of risk, used to justify the permissibility of clinical trials as a favorable risk-benefit ratio, is ethically deficient. It is ethically deficient because it doesn't safeguard trial participants against exploitation. So with the principal requirement that risks and potential benefits should be fairly distributed, my ethical view of risk safeguards trial participants from exploitation. And I illustrate my analysis with the idea of a shorter regimen of AZT in mother-to-child transmission of HIV in Africa. So, structure as follows. I start with the typical meanings of risk in biomedical research, and I give a particular attention to the reason why interpretations of risk can be a problem for a proper assessment of the ethical permissibility of these experiments of clinical trials. Then I go on to argue for my view of risk, followed by an illustration of the view with the case study. The last section I conclude by raising further questions of philosophical interests regarding risks in clinical trials. Here are the most common ones according to 2009, which is a philosopher of risk. Number 1, an unwanted event which may or may not occur. As in, for instance, lung cancer is one of the major risks that affects smokers. 2, cause of an unwanted event which may or may not occur. For instance, smoking is by far the most important risk in industrialized countries. A third interpretation, the probability of an unwanted event which may not occur. As in, there is evidence that the risk of having one's life shortened by smoking is as high as 50%. A fourth meaning, the statistical expectation value of an unwanted event which may or may not occur. As in, the total risk from smoking is higher than that of any other cause that has been analyzed by risk analysts. And here is the fifth meaning of risk. The fact that a decision under conditions of known probabilities, as in decision under risk as opposed to decision under uncertainty. For instance, the probability of various smoking-related diseases are so well known that a decision whether or not to smoke can be classified as a decision under risk. According to Vager 2007, risk is a multidimensional concept involving both the probability and the magnitude of harms to research participants. So according to this orthodox thinking, risk depends on magnitude of a particular unfavorable outcome, for instance like death or a serious side effect, as well as the likelihood or probability of the particular unfavorable event occurring. The implication of such view is that whatever a proper or ethical analysis of risk demands, the analysis would be incomplete without considering both the magnitude of the harm and its probability of occurring. According to the Belmont report, it says, quote, benefits and risks should be balanced and shown to be in a favorable ratio. But the risk-benefit ratio is a misuse of the term, risk. Because technically speaking, the ratio is meant as that of a harm benefit to trial participants, not of risk benefit. The more appropriate parallel construction should be that of a ratio of risks and potential benefits to trial participants. Now, there isn't common agreement about how one should balance risk and potential benefits if justifying a clinical trial. So given the multidimensionality of risk, the question many researchers have to ponder with is whether there are any principal ways of countervailing risks with potential benefits. The common assumption among experts is that a favorable risk-benefit ratio justifies the trial. That so long as the risks trial are counterbalanced by potential benefits to participants, ethical permissibility is met, since there you have sufficient conditions for the permissibility of the study. Okay, so on to my view. My ethical analysis of risk begins with the idea that a clinical trial is morally impermissible when the distribution of risks and potential benefits is unfair. The emphasis on the unfairness of the distribution of risk and potential benefit is meant to underscore the point that not all instances of an unbalanced risk ratio, as in, for example, too much risk and little potential benefit, necessarily problematic, or that the trial is ethically suspect. I take it that a central task for an ethical view of risk is to have a principle that risks must be reasonable in relation to anticipated benefits, yet the reasonability is in a moral sense of reasonability. So when looking at risks in a clinical trial, we should take into account, to the extent that this is feasibly possible, all types of risks and benefits participants are subject to during participation in that trial, in that experiment. So the fair distribution of risk is to protect trial participants from risks that are not justified by a favorable risk-benefit ratio, or by whether the expected net total is simply positive or negative. The fair distribution of risk is not meant to protect participants from high risks in clinical trials. Participants wish to take such risks. An implication I view is that high risks are morally permissible so long as distribution with potential benefits is done fairly. Like Wertheimer in 2010, I do acknowledge the fact that in practice, review boards, via our current institution of informed consent, may prohibit subject participation in trials with high risks, even when the potential benefits may outweigh those risks. But that's a different issue. So my objective is not to defend or promote subjects to be allowed to take high risks, so long as potential benefits outweigh those risks. Even though my argument permits such position, it is neither a necessary nor a sufficient condition for the ethical permissibility of clinical trials, according to my view. So the motivation for a fair distribution of risks and benefits comes primarily from two interconnected views of clinical trials. One, the view that a clinical trial is a public experiment aimed at producing important, beneficial knowledge. And two, the view that subjects should not be exploited by clinical trials, even in trials where it's shown a favorable risk-benefit ratio to trial participants. So if we accept one, that clinical trials should not be permitted if their goal is producing important generalizable. If we accept one, that clinical trials should only be permitted if their goal is producing important generalizable knowledge that can benefit a target population of which trial participants are selected from. Yet, if risks are allowed justification so long as they are outweighed by potential benefit to trial participants, then the distribution of benefits and risk is hardly fair. It's hardly fair because by linking risk-benefit ratio only to trial participants, the trial misses on its epistemic goal. It misses its goal because it cannot offer benefit to the population that legitimizes the taking of risks its members are exposed to as research subjects. Again, because a clinical trial is a public experiment, as such, it makes little sense if its potential benefits and risks are limited to the small group of trial participants in the study. Okay. Case study. The goal of a short regimen AZT, the goal was to assess whether lower doses of AZT than those administered in the United States to reduce the rate of mother-to-child transmission of HIV. The normal regimen of AZT, which was previously evaluated and approved through Protocol 6 in the US, was deemed too costly to African populations. The average cost for the full regimen was over $1,000 per woman per year, whereas the annual health budget of African countries was under $10 per person. For instance, Uganda's health budget during the 1990s was estimated to be under $3 per person per year. So from the start, there were divided opinions among the expert communities over the ethical permissibility of trials, running randomized control studies in Africa, right? Among supporting the ethical permissibility of the risks imposed on trial participants were the director of the National Institutes of Health and the director of the Centers for Disease Control, defending the view that risks from using placebos were justifiable given the complexities of the situations in Africa and its urgent needs. According to Glantz, 2008, however, if a clinical trial yields beneficial knowledge, these benefits must actually reach individuals in the countries in which the trial took place. Otherwise, the subjects will have been exploited. The moral implication being that, quote, an essential trial requisite to designing ethical research in developing countries is identifying the source and the amount of funding for providing the fruits of the research to the people of the developing country. Now, since the results and publication of these studies, the National Bioethics Advisory Committee here in the US began to support the following ethical view of clinical trials. Quote, if the intervention being tested is not likely to be affordable in the host country, or if the healthcare infrastructure cannot support its proper distribution and use, it is unethical to ask persons in that country to participate in research, since they will not enjoy any of the potential benefits. They come a long way acknowledging that. Here are some final remarks then. Even though the epistemic requirements of clinical trials are well understood, including the public nature of such experiments, the fair distribution of risks and potential benefits is a moral mandate rarely followed. Paper, I provided some preliminary examination of this problem of risk to trial participants. More research is needed on the way risks and potential benefits can be fairly distributed to trial participants, especially for marginalized populations. And the way these risks should reflect those of the wider population which the participants come from. Now, I'd like to end with a few questions. Perhaps we'll have a chance to talk about them, to try to address them. First question, can a traditional approach to exploitation, for instance, the orthodox Marxist approach to exploitation, serve as a model for thinking about risk exploitation in clinical trials? Second, must the exploitation of clinical trials be involuntary? So that is to say, as long as you have an informed consent and trial participants are well informed and rational and so forth, can you still say that there's space, room to say that trial participants might have been exploited despite consent? Third, does it follow from the fact that a clinical trial that exploits participants on risks, that it ought to be legally prohibited? So the relationship between the morality and the legal prohibition of studies. And that's it for my talk.